In the last lecture, we saw how the Sanskrit model went eastwards. I gave a very abbreviated version of that for a simple reason. In 1937, when Diringer wrote his standard book on the history of alphabets, he went into great detail about that eastward movement, and it didn't seem to me reasonable to just try to repeat what he said. I said a couple of new things en passant, but basically that was a very short version. Now we're going westward, and it will be a longer version because there are some controversial things that I'm going to say about how we got from India to the West. There is a story that I'm not telling you, and that is the story that goes via the Silk Roads. Namely, remember in the introduction I showed you how the 16 nations or the 16 tribes of the Ahuras in Afghanistan became the 16 Vendidad nations that crossed the whole of Middle Asia all the way to Turkey. And so there is a way in which the Sanskrit alphabet becomes the basis of the Avestan alphabet, becomes the basis of the Sumerian, and so on. And I will touch upon that in one of the future lectures. But my concern in this lecture is to follow the spice roads, namely by ship, from India to the coast of Africa, and then up to Egypt, and then ultimately to the rest of Europe. So our story has to be quite complicated because we must remember that there was an indigenous an indigenous Egyptian set of letters that started with the hieroglyphs, which in turn came, as we said, from the Oromos and the people in Sudan. And I show you once again the Mimshim alphabet, and we'll not go into the details of that. There are variants of this Mimshim alphabet, such as this one, and then there are early alphabets such as Dravidian and Hermesian, which form the basis of Egyptian 1 and Egyptian 2. And Dravidian was used both in India and in Egypt. So already at the outset, there are connections that have been forgotten. This is Kuseum. Here you see two, they're called the first Egyptian alphabet and an other Egyptian alphabet in Durée in 1613, and here you see their equivalents in Fry in 1799 as Egyptian 1 and Egyptian 2. Given our discussions in the earlier ones, you see that what you would call the Trishula comes back here as the letter F and recurs here in Egyptian 2. Then there is this Indicum, and I drew your attention in the last lecture to this letter, which is found both in Tibetan and in the Javanese alphabets. And this becomes the alphabet of Mercurius thought, or Toit, and that becomes Mercurianum and linked with Egyptian 4, and has some links with the Alphabetum Chaldaicum Antiquorum. But here is when the story really gets started. So we have an alphabet called Indicum, and it changes the order of things that we're used to. Namely, it goes ha, la, ha, ma, sa, ra, sa, ha, ba, ra, ha, ma, and then the letter A, and then CH, and then VA, and then Rein, and then so on. Now, all of this seems very mysterious until you realize that in our Western languages, we can say ah, but if I am doing an aspirated version, so emphasizing it, then I say ha, as opposed to ah. And so ha la ha ma, and you'll see this when we get to the 22-letter alphabets, you'll see we can start the letters, we can have the first 11 letters and then the next 11 letters. And then the first letter is A, yes, and the second letter is L. Then the third letter on the first row, or sorry, the second letter in the first row, but the third letter is A, L, B, M, right? So if I go A-L, it's B-M, C, N, and so on. So if you learn to think of this as A-L, A-M, this is just a little twist. Now we're going to come back to this because it's quite important to start to understand some of the complexities of what's going on. Anyway, here it's called Indicum. We are in an alphabet published by Mr. Postel, Guillaume Postel, in 1538. It's not normally shown in the modern versions. Now, here is the Alphabetum seu potius syllabarium literarum Chaldearum. So, an alphabet, or rather, a syllable of letters of the Chaldeans. Now remember, we showed you Middle Asia, and in Middle Asia there was the Median Empire, which becomes then the Persian Empire, and below there was a small section in red, and that was the Chaldean Empire. Well, this looks very original and beautiful and impressive and so on, except, look carefully, ladies and gentlemen, ha, la, oh, ha, ha, la, ha. So, and look at the letters. It's a copy. And now, one further, well, there you see it in isolation. And now we have the Ethiopian World Federation incorporated, and what do we have? Hala, Hama, Sara, and so on. So we have Indicum, Chaldeicum, and Amharic, which is the official language of Ethiopia, the kind of the book version of scripts for Ethiopia, all the same. The plot thickens. Now, it's going to get a bit complicated, but so please be patient with me, because I'll try to keep it as simple as possible, but it's not really simple. So we have two languages. We have Ethiopic and Amharic. Now, you will notice that there are 33 letters, but you'll notice that 7 of them have little dots. And so Amharic has 33, and then if I take away the ones with the dots, I have 26. And then I have Ethiopian. Okay? But again, hoi lawi, haut mai. All right, so the sound, well, here you see the sounds ha la, ha ma. It's the same, except now we have names for them. Yes? And the important thing for our story is that A starts here at letter 13, and Hein starts here. And if you look across here, Hein is not just the letter Hein, which we saw, remember, was a Sanskrit letter AI, which becomes Hein and Hein, yes? And then it's A, U, I. So these are actually all the vowels now in one letter. Now this is again important. Oh, and here at the bottom you have some diphthongs. So basically a combination of a vowel and a consonant together. So ka, kai, ka, sa, ksa, and so on. Now, here it's called Ethiopian and Abyssinian. in Abyssinian is the same effectively as Amharic, except in this case, those 7 things that were marked with a little dot have now been put aside here below. Yes? And so now I have 26 letters. Yes? But now look carefully, ladies and gentlemen, because here I have ha, la, ha, ma, and so on. Except look at this line, please. And what do I have? I have Hebrew letters. Yes? So, of course, we know that there are Ethiopian Jews. They have a book of Enoch that is older than the Jewish Bible and is not normally discussed by either the Jews or the Christians. But there is now a story that's getting more complicated because we have Indian, Chaldean, Ethiopian, Abyssinian, and Amharic, all connected and linked with Jewish, with Hebrew. Yes? Now, next. Now, this is possibly the most important one that I'm going to show you, but it isn't obvious at first sight. And you have to look at this closely to understand it. Well, I'll begin with something quite curious. Guo, wo, ko, cho. These are 4 Chinese sounds thrown in for good luck to get from 22 to 26. But now, if you look at the official sequence, it goes a, ba, ga, da, ha, va, za, ha, ta, ya, ka, la, ma, na. So A, B, G, D, H, W, Z, H, T, Y, K, L, M, N. And this is, of course, the sequence of the Abjad. So Abjad, Huti, Hawaz, Huti, Kalaman, Safas, Karashat, and so on. That's the sequence that's known as the Arabic sequence, and it's supposed to be the beginning of the Arabic story, and it's also the sequence of the Hebrew story. Except, ladies and gentlemen, you notice that there are funny little numbers on top of this. So if I go now to the first number, I go ha, la, ha, ma. Hey, wait, doesn't that sound familiar? So the implication of this is staggering because it means that that order of the Indicum, Abyssinian, Amharic, Ethiopian of HL, HM, meaning Hala, Hama, is first, and then it got rearranged to be ABGD and so on. Okay? And then we see a version, well, this is a Russian version of how the things go A, B, C, D, and so on, linked with the planets. But here below, we have now the modern order, A, B, G, D, H, W. So that's this order again, but now writing it slightly differently. And now I have a 22-letter alphabet. Well, basically, I've got rid of those 4. So I have 33 minus 7, 26 minus 4, 22. Now, this is extremely important because, of course, Sanskrit is 33. And so I have 33, varied a bit. I take away 7, I get 26. I take away 4, and I get 22. And so the 22 is not just an invention out of the blue. It's a Reader's Digest version of this very complicated alphabet. Am I clear so far? All right, because now it gets more interesting, more dramatic still. And please forgive me for my ineptitude at doing it as neatly as I can. Okay, so now there are a series of these old alphabets. There is one in the library in Venice, and I think the ordering here is wrong, but I'll tell you that in a moment. So here we have one, is called Autre Alphabet Alphabet des Indiens de la Bibliothèque Grimanienne, so in Venice. And we see now Alefu, Bethu, Gemellier, some funny name, and so on. And if we go to, so here we're in 1613, here's the version of Mr. Fry in London, and clearly it's the same alphabet, yes? I mean, this letter is that one's that one, yes? And here, supposedly alphabet Indian 2, we have this one, which is based on this one. Except this one has Aphabets, remember that one from the very first? So, but now let's start to compare. So we have one that goes this way, this one goes that way, and so we have a 22 letter, we have a 26 letter, and we have a 45 letter version. Now let's do some comparison. So here are the 22 letters in the original order, and this is the order that they are shown in on that first of the series of slides that I showed you. Yes, Abba, Gada, and so on. And so this is the Abjad version. But now, just for fun, I compare the alphabet. So the first letter in that 45 letter version is Alefu. Yes? Now in Indian 1, according to them, Alefu is written as one letter. Yes? As this one. Which then becomes this letter, becomes that letter, and then becomes Aleph. This, the next two letters are Beth, Beth, that becomes Bethu, becomes that, becomes that, becomes Beth. This one, Gamelier, becomes Gamelia, becomes this, becomes that, becomes that. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that if we take, just for fun, go back for a second, if we go to this one and just take the longer sequences of all those letters, then we get the following. Alefu, Beth, Beth, Gamelier, Dalezu, He, Muf, something Muf, Zain, Haitin, Yodu, Kafu, Lamedu, and so on. And you see the rest. Now, let me just simplify that Alefu. It becomes Aleph. Beth, Beth, Beth. Gamelier, Gimel. So I am suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, we assume that Aleph, Beth, Gimel, these are the words that God gave down to Moses when he created the alphabet, or 2,000 years before the creation, according to some sources. But now we're seeing that these funny words from the Indian Ethiopians are, in fact, the sources of the Hebrew letters, names of the Hebrew letters, and all of them fit. And so this, if I'm right, means that not only does Brahmanicum at the time of Solomon come from the Indus Valley, but the very names of the Hebrew letters come via the Ethiopian. And this is, I think, a remarkable little story in itself. So, let's just go back 2 slides. What I am suggesting is this, that although Mr. Fry called this one Indian 1 and this one Indian 2, if my reasoning is correct, then this must have been Indian 1, because it's an abbreviation of this that leads to this version. And so this would be Indian 2. And if you think back on those earlier alphabets where it starts ha, la, ha, ma, if you think of Sanskrit, Sanskrit starts with a, well, in the vowels, but ends with an aspirate H, ha, in the Savarka, yes? And so probably these people who were Indian Ethiopians would be closer to that. So rather than starting with the vowel ah, they were starting with the last letter of the alphabet as the first letter of their alphabet. And so just as we now talk about hamzas in Arabic, this is a kind of hamza, but it's just a ha of the hamza. And so we have a Sanskrit that starts with H rather than, or a version of Sanskrit that starts with H rather than A. And then we get this extended version with different sounds. We compress that and get this version. And now we're ready to go on to see what happens. And then the abbreviation of this, well, that gives you the Aphabets of the 22 letters of Hebrew. And so now we're going to go through some of the other links, linking the East and West. Here is Indicum, which is, you will see that I'm suggesting that really is now an equivalent of Indian 2. That leads us to the premier alphabet, de Salomon, the first alphabet of Solomon, and it becomes Hebrew 2. And you can see the links to the letters are quite clear. And then Brahmanicum, which we saw at an earlier stage, becomes the second alphabet of Solomon and becomes Hebrew 3. And it's too clear to be discussed. It's there. And so at the latest, in the 900s BC, when Solomon lived, the Hebrews copied Brahmanicum to create an alphabet of Solomon that became the third alphabet of the Hebrews. And now we're going to look at some of the other languages in the general area. So there's Ethiopiacum, which links with Sabaeum, and people have made links. Well, this is a so-called South Semitic alphabet, and some people have linked this with Brahmi. I won't go into the details. And now I'm going to go through some of the major language families of the Middle East to show you the connection. So I told you that there was a prophet Enoch. He's in the 3rd millennium BC, and according to the Ethiopians, again, he lives somewhere there in Ethiopia. Well, here is Enocheum is his alphabet, yes? Ladies and gentlemen, I present you the alphabet of Mosaicum, so Moses' alphabet. Well, forgive my saying so, but I think either Moses was a good copier or he didn't give his sources, because the connections between these two are a bit too much to be overlooked. And Esdras, who was, of course, the prophet of the Jews when the Jews were in the so-called Babylonian captivity, but actually, basically, the elite of the Jews went to Babylon and rewrote the Bible there. And what does the alphabet of Esdras remind you of? It looks, well, I'll put it politely, a heaven like Enocheum and Mosaicum. And that then becomes the caractère des Juifs and so on. Caractère inventé par Esdras ou Jésus, son fils. So the son of Esdras in the 6th century was also called Jesus, long before Jesus was started, when he started at the year 0 and started Christianity. Now, another one of the great Old Testament figures is called Noah, Noachicum. Well, and this is the first alphabet of the Etruscans. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that Noah and the Etruscans must have met. And here is Hetruscum, well, again, and this is another alphabet, so the second alphabet of the Etruscans. Again, well, the difference being that this one goes this way, and this, no, they both go that way. But again, so this one goes that way, and that one goes that way. But again, the connections are too clear to argue, and this becomes Etruscan 3, and this becomes Etruscan 2. So there is Etruscan is normally considered the oldest of the Western European alphabets, but now we see it's linking with Old Testament figures. And then there's Chaldean 10, which links to the alphabet of the Hebrews before Esdras. So now we're before the 6th century, and that links with the passing of the river alphabet. And again, there are connections. They're not. So I have made a list of a summary of this as one chart, and so that you can get a chronology. 4th millennium BC, Enoch. 3rd millennium BC, Noah, Noachicum, premier alphabet Etruscan 3, alphabet Noachicum, autre alphabet Etrusque. 2nd millennium BC, Chaldeicum, Syriacum, caractère céleste, Chaldean 1, or passing of the river. 2nd millennium Moses, Hebraicum, similar to Chaldean 11. 1st millennium BC, Solomon, premier alphabet de Solomon, Solomonicum, compare Indicum, compare Hebrew 2. 2nd alphabet of Solomon, Brahmanicum, Hebrew 3. 747 BC, Judaicum, done from the alphabet of Adam, which is close to Babylonicum, which is close to Chaldean 16, and close to that of the Maronites, whom we encountered for. And finally, in the 5th century BC, Esdras. And so here are all the Hebrew patriarchs who have alphabets before the modern times. And then I take Fry's 1799 list of 9 alphabets and show you how they link up. So Hebrew 1, Hebrew 2, Hebrew 3 we've already done. Hebrew 4 is Germano-Rabbinicum, so the rabbinical version of German. And this is the rabbinical version of Hispanic. And Hebrew 6 is Judeo-Persian, and Hebrew 7 is modern Portuguese Hebraic. And then Hebrew 9 is Chaldean 12. So this is useful because we have these old sources, but now in one chart you can see how it fits with our modern versions. And here I've taken the 18 alphabets of Mr. Fry and shown how all of those link. Well, I'm not going to go through all of this again. Of interest is that 4 is the alphabet of Seth. 7 and 8 are Abraham. 9 and 10 are Moses. No, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are Moses. And then 13 we're back in Baghdad. And then Judaic and so on. And we'll come back to these at a later stage. So just to make that more obvious, here I show you Chaldean 11 and Hebraicum. Here I show you Chaldean 12 and Hebrew 9. Chaldean 13 is Canaanite, from the province of Canaan, which was there before the Hebrews were. And here Chaldean 15 is Palestine, or Palestinian, who supposedly are upstarts according to modern stories, but in fact it is based on Chaldean. And 16 is the alphabet of Babylon. And I will come back to all of this in one of the appendices. I will then go through all of those 17 and show you all the correspondences. But that's a level of detail which at this point of our story is not terribly important. Of importance in our story at the moment is that there are different ways of arranging the letters. So the obvious way is ABCD or ABGD, and those classes we will get to in the next lecture but one. But there are then patterns of letters So I take letter 1, letter 9, and letter 17. And that and they were arranged in rows, and so if I read then along the left or the right hand, depending on which direction it's going, then I get ADV, ADY, AICH, and so on. And these are the number of letters in the alphabet, which vary from 20 to 25, or 27 in these cases. But letters 1, 9, and 17 gives me then a gematria, or a mathematical value, of 1, 9, and 80. So that's 90 as a whole. So I get AIQ, AIR, AIS, AKS, and so on. Yes? That's easy. But now it gets interesting, because now I have the letters 1, 12, and 17. I add them together and I get 130 and 80, and that's 111. But now what are the letters involved? ALA, ALAF, ALF, ALP, ALPH, ALAF, ALEPH. These are all the these are all the letters that we use to describe the letter A. Aleph, Alaf. So Aleph, or Alif, or Alaf, or, well, A is too short, but A is an abbreviation of these. But the abbreviation is not of a letter, it's of a sequence of letters that defines a whole category of alphabets. There is a change. Now, I'll come back to explain why this change takes place, but remember I said 1, 10, and 19 is important. Now, think of also the nakshatras, 1, 12, and 17. This used to be where the root was. And now, and then in the modern version, it's 1, 10, 19. And 1, 10, and 19 gives me 1 plus 10 is 11 plus 100. We're back at 111. Yes? And that gives me ADT, AIA, AIH, AIO, AIQ, AQH, and so on. So we have primitive alphabets that lead to 90. And remember, I didn't make the point very clearly, but remember when we were starting breathing, and I told you that the alphabets, well, there was 1, 5, 9, and then 9, 90, 900. And I showed you that the 90 was man. So this, in a sense, is man. But then when you get a further version, you get the first letter of the alphabet. And then the more complex version is this one. And this 1, 10, 19, well, then that means that the next series is 2, 11, 20, 3, 12, 21. And all of that comes from an alignment of the nakshatras with the 9 planets. But that will be Appendix 3. So we're getting ahead of ourselves. But just to show you that what looks like just a letter, or a word for a letter, has in fact a whole structure, hidden structure behind it. And that's one of the purposes of the story that we're telling. Okay, now this bit you've heard again, but now we're going to see it in slightly more detail. I told you that the first alphabet, according to the general stories, is Phoenician, east coast of the Mediterranean. But I told you that came from Assyrian. Now you see the first alphabet of the Phoenicians. That becomes the alphabet of the Syriorum, and that becomes Phoenician 1. And you'll see, now this one is going this way, this one's going this way, this one is going that way, this one is going that way. You have to do a bit of, you have to be awake for this one, but it's there. Yes? And then I said the second one came not from Assyria, present-day Iraq, but came from northwestern Saudi Arabia. The Saracens, in the Middle Ages, the Saracens and the Arabs were confused, and people talked about Saracens as if they were Arabs, but in fact the Saracens were the foot soldiers for the Ionians. They were a military group of people. They were mercenaries, in the same way that there are now 360,000 mercenaries in a place called Syria, destroying Syrian culture. But they weren't just destroyers, but they were basically paid people to fight. So here we have Saracen. That becomes the other alphabet of the Phoenicians, or Ionic. And notice that there is an eightfold star as a letter. And that becomes the alphabet of the Alphabetum Saracenorum. And then that becomes Saracen 2, which again goes that way. And then you have Chaldean 3. That becomes Phoenician, another version of Phoenicium. And ladies and gentlemen, look at these letters, and now look at Alphabet franquique selon Sudi Abbé Tritem. So Tritemius was a 16th century philosopher, historian in France, but clearly, well, the Phoenicians sailed to both Carthage in the south and to Marseille in the north of the. And it's clearly that letter is that, and this letter is that, and so on. And so we see how Phoenician, that starts in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, goes to the west coast of Turkey, becomes the Phoenician language along the east coast of the Mediterranean, and then spreads to France. And there can be very little doubt about this route. And so then the whole notion that we have in about 90% of textbooks that, it all started with the Phoenicians is simply wrong. And this is another reason why I say we need a dictionary, not just of words, but a dictionary of letters, so that we can do a history of the letter A and a history of the letter B, not only for this part of the world, but really for the whole world. Well, to give you an idea of how complex the story potentially is, here is Punic, Pelasian, Phoenician, and ancient Hebraic or Samaritan. And look at how many varieties of writing for a single letter there are. So again, it's a notion that I've been making right from the start when I showed you the 33 versions of the Greek alphabet. We're told in school, well, you draw A, B is this way, C is this way. It's all straightforward. And when I started learning Greek, same thing. It was all straightforward. Nice square letters, all in a row. But in fact, the history is much, much more complicated, as we see here. And here is Phoenician 7. And again, you see how much variety there is in each of the single letters. Here's the modern version there. Well, here now we have the first alphabet of the Syrians. And then we have square Syriac. Yes, and this is hard. We're not able to see it properly here. But here under Hein, so this is the Hein thing again, you will notice a whole series of things. There are a whole series, all the 5 vowels that we showed you in the Ethiopian, linked with Rhein, are also linked here. Now, the standard story for Hebrew is, the Hebrews didn't have any vowels. But, and this becomes the basis of the alphabet of Abraham, which is also the alphabet of the Syrians. And I encourage you to look at this letter, Skith and Thoth. Seth and Thoth. Thoth is another name for Hermes. We're going to come back to that. Implicit in this little picture that seems so simple is a more complicated story. You will recall in my first lecture, I talked about a language called Syrianum of 28 letters, which had made its way all the way to East Asia. And so, although in the Hebrew-oriented world, the alphabet of Abraham is one of the first of the letters, the alphabets. Clearly, there must have been a 28-letter alphabet of Syrian before a 22-letter alphabet of Syriac, and the connections then with Abraham and Syriorum, which is again a 22-letter alphabet, is a second chapter in this forgotten story. But that would be getting us, we can't go into all of those details. My point in this lecture is to make a very simple observation, that letters which start in India make their way to northeast coast of Africa, move up to Egypt, and then from there move to the western coast, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and become part of the grounds from which we get the modern languages, alphabets of Europe. But implicit in that statement is that it was not the models of Greece that were important. Remember, I told you that the Greek alphabet was, as an ABC, active 800 BC, that is to say 500 years before 405, when the Ionian made its way to Athens. And in Egypt, instead of a zodiac of 12 signs, well, you have a zodiac of 12 signs, but you also have 36 decans. Yes, so the decan is when you split the 360 into groups. And so each one of the 12 divides into another 3. Yes? And if I start here, then number 18 is here with the twins of Gemini, and number 19 is the second half of the year. Yes? If this is January and we go to Gemini and then we split and so on. Now, this is a god called Hermanubis or Hermes, whose other name is Thought. Now, remember I said Skith and Thought? Skith splits up into 2 letters. So the split between the 2 letters here, or the 2 twins, is a split in these 2 letters. And Thought is at number 19, which, remember, in terms of the sequence, is where life begins, and it's also the number of Eve. And so, linked with this is the split between the darkness and the light. If you remember the calendar where I talked about this. So this alphabet, on the one hand, is just about letters, but if we look at the sequence again, it's the 18, 19, 20. That takes place right here. And then the 22 takes place here, and that's the end then of the alphabet of the 22-letter people. And notice that the 69 that we associate with Cancer and so on is right there between 21 and 22. So that's the switch, and then the new alphabet starts here. So there is a early model in in the south, in what we now call Sudan and Ethiopia and so on. That moves to Egypt. There you get one model using the Syrian influence, and then that gets simplified again and goes from 28 to 22, aligned with this, and then it goes further north and then becomes the modern alphabets that we now know today. That is conjecture, but I think worth thinking about. Now, if we take that one step further, then we go back to that old alphabet, then we see that 17 is this. Remember the one where the letters are abagada, but that they have funny numbers on top. So now I've put them in numerical order, 17, 18, 19, 20, yes? And we have za, yod, da, ga, pa, tsa. So there's the alphabet as a whole that we saw before. Here you see them now in in numerical order. So this would be za, this would be yod, yes, this would be da, and this would be ga, and this would be pa and tsa, yes? So we are now aligning the decans 17 to 22, to 21, 20, yes, with the letters. Now this gets interesting because the J, the letters 18, 19, 20 are Jai, Jaman, Dent. Now, in Sanskrit, the word is Jan, so birth. So you notice that this P is Yud, which, so 18 becomes letter 10. I told you there was an old model and a new model. In the old model, it's letter 18. In the new model, it becomes letter 10. And this one is Jaman, and it becomes iota. Oh, there you see, yes, Jaman. And it's the same. And so this split between 18 and 19 is the split between, is the split where the two twins come, or just after the two twins, and then we get man and wife, or a birth. Here is an old Russian mudra for the letter O, and this is the old mudra for the letter D, and that's this letter, and here is the mudra for D Daleth in this form. And here are other versions of D. Now remember I told you about the Cairo when we were talking about Karashat and about the P that is actually an R and that is about more and increase? Well, now we see, and this is the flag of the Eastern Empire, where that P is actually a rho, and that's the R of Christ, Christ. So this 1819 and rebirth, birth and rebirth is linked then with these letters. And there is an extraordinary way in which the Russian mudras, the D and the P, are all connected. And so just for fun, I show you, well, this is the sequence in Ethiopian, and now you see sequences in different alphabets, and then the E, Z. Remember, we showed you the dragon going down and the snake going up in the Chinese. And we saw that that was an S, which then reversed to become a backwards S. And that became the stigma, which had to be removed because it was troubling the situation. Well, one of the ways of doing it, it becomes an E that's then reversed as well, as the Americans would so charmingly say, a Z or a Z, yes? And these are in different alphabets. And here are other versions of the same thing. So right across the alphabets, there is an extraordinary way in which mirroring becomes a part of the story. And here, for fun, I take, well, I told you Karashat, so Abjad, Hawaz, Huti, and so on. And then when we get to QRST, so Kofres Shin Tau in Hebrew. Here it is in hieroglyphics. Here it is in Hebrew. Here it is in another version of Hebrew. Here it is in Coptic. and that becomes Kinin, Rof, Skith, Toth in Siriorum, and here you see QRST in Gothic. And so what we're starting to see is that although if I say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and so on, that sounds very different from A, Ba, Ga, Da, and so on. But when you line them up, which we'll do in a future lecture, then you'll see that, well, there's A, B, G, D, or A, B, C, D. That's more or less the same. Then there's a bit that's different, another bit that's slightly different, but then KLMN is the same in all of them. And then there's a bit that's different, and then there's QRST is the same in each of those. And so the underlying pattern of ABCD, KLMN, QRST, goes back 4000 BC. Then there's bits that you change, and those create the different alphabets. So I am telling you an incomplete story at the moment, but I am showing you that things that Egyptian, Coptic, Hebrew, Gothic, which we don't think of as the same, have a deeper underlying structure, to which I will return in lecture 10. Another glimpse at this deeper underlying thing, the 22-letter alphabets all end with T. And then in English we have U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And in Greek we have Phi, Chi, Psi, which, remember, makes that little man of a P, an X, and a Psi. Here is the alphabet of Alexander the Great, who, of course, had quite a bit of experience because he got all the way to India, and therefore it's not a coincidence that what does he have? He has the Pa of the Parvarga, the PH of the Parvarga, and he has the Chinese yen, the Japanese yen. Maybe one of his advanced soldiers got further than we thought. And then here is another alphabet, Jacobiteum, and what do we have? Ye, Phi, Chi, Ebri. And what is this letter? This letter, ladies and gentlemen, is that a letter that we now associate with the 8 symbol, but which is the essence of the male and is the ha of the breath of God. And here you have Wiri, and here you have Phi, Chi, Psi in various versions. And so we again see that what starts as seemingly completely different alphabets really again have underlying bits that are the same. And so here I take you to the letter Phi in Coptic, Ve. Here that becomes the letter Pa in the Parvarga, and that becomes the letter V, V-I-E, which of course is the word for life in Georgian, yes? And here you have Russian and other versions. And then here again. And so, at a very deep level, there is a direct connection between, well, you have to take away Fa's cap, or the top line, but then the Pa of the Fa Varga becomes the basis of another of the aspects of the alphabets of life, and that leads you to Cherv, which links up with the male member in Old Russian. And similarly, the Kai, this one, gets linked with the the Na of Jana in a geometric version of Brahmi. And then you can see that coming, well, it links up with Saturn here, with these, and then again across the languages. Here, just for fun, I take you to Old Nubian and Old Coptic. They are not absolutely identical, but you can see that there's enough identical that really it's not worth having a big fight about. And here I show you Nubian and Arabic. And again, there is a link that is not worth fighting about. And that's another page of that. And here, just for fun, I take you to Coptic, Slavitsa, so one of the old Russian versions, and the Greek alphabet. And again, this goes alpha vita, this goes alpha beta. And so you have two B's now, a B and a V, and a G, and so on. And here you have A, B, G, D again. So, and here for fun, I take you through 5 languages and do P, T, Z in those 5 languages. And again, we could easily spend 26 hours discussing the history of those 3 letters. That's not my point here. My point is to make the story simple. We can go to the next one. We have a Sanskrit model. It goes to Africa. It gets simplified, turned around, and then we get standard 22-letter alphabets. And this all happens well before 2000 BC. Then around 1000 BC, it becomes standardized into things like Phoenician and Hebrew. But now, and this is the end of today's story, then in 700 AD, we have the alphabet Betum Copticum e Greco. So now you take the Greek alphabet and you get a new version of Coptic in 22 letters. Or an alphabetum Ethiopiacum e Coptico in 800 AD. So we have this prehistory. It goes to form 22-letter alphabets. Then Greek is the standard, and Greek becomes the model for Coptic, becomes the model for Ethiopian. And then everyone says, oh yes, it all came from Greece. But there is a saying in the law, post hoc is not always propter hoc. So just because this came later is not necessarily the way it actually began. And I hope today I have, on my very quick ship's journey, given you a glimpse into a richer and more tantalizing view of how the worlds of the East and the West are connected. Thank you very much.